Our Ball State Today program includes a talk with a Ball State handicapped graduate who has become successful in the business world, a psychologist who tells us how to be positive in a negative world, and a community planner who talks about developing your community resources. Dr. Greg Thompson, Director of Human Resources at Milwaukee's Medical Rehabilitation Institute, was honored by Ball State members of Disabled Students in Action, who gave him the 1986 Outstanding Alumnus Award. Dr. Thompson completed 2 of his 3 degrees at Ball State University. A quadriplegic since a 1969 swimming accident, he talks with us about the role of the disabled in today's society. Greg, what have you done since you graduated from Ball State in 1976?
When I left Ball State, I then went to Milwaukee and became Director of Handicap Services at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And I also, at that time, became involved in a lot of community organizations, and one of those happened to be Sacred Heart Rehabilitation Hospital in Milwaukee. And I was on the board of directors there and got to know the president quite well. And my 3rd year in Milwaukee, he invited me to come to Sacred Heart and become Director of Human Resources. So I took a look at the job and decided it'd be kind of a nice opportunity and did do that. So I'm currently the Director of Human Resources at Sacred Heart Rehab Hospital, and then I'm also involved in a number of other community organizations yet.
We've made great strides in making accessibility available for the disabled. There was a great thrust in the 70s. Is that continuing?
I think politically, you don't see the strides that you see made, or you saw made during the early 70s. The Reagan administration hasn't been as favorable toward the development of the disabled movement. However, I think that you see that a lot of things that did happen during the 70s did take off. I think one important thing that did happen is that the disabled learned an awful lot about being advocates for themselves. And they become good spokespersons, and they've done an awful lot to forward a lot of progress throughout the nation that way. So maybe in that respect, the loss of all the federal government help hasn't been that bad. We were able to get Section 504 of the Rehab Act passed. A lot of other regulations requiring that the buildings be accessible, and that didn't help a lot.
Is that what 504 refers to?
Yeah, Section 504 of the Rehab Act in 1973, there are a number of sections to the Rehab Act, but one happens to be to make facilities accessible. It's looked upon as a civil rights act for the handicapped, and that made a lot of strides throughout the nation, because any organization that received or was a recipient of federal funding was required at that time to make their facilities and programs accessible. That's still the case. However, the federal government's really never been a watchdog on that, and they're even less so now. They really don't check anybody to make sure they are accessible. But the disabled, it gave them a good emotional boost. And I think you found from that that the disabled really did begin to believe in themselves, which is probably the most important thing anyway. If you look at it in terms of kind of like a social movement, that's probably what happened.
At least they were aware of the support, and this was important.
That's right.
People were beginning to recognize the problems. We have now Graham Rudman. Is that going to affect our disabled programs?
I think Graham Rudman, if it does go into effect as everybody hears that it's going to, is going to have a tremendous effect on the disabled. I think it's going to be important, though, to remember that those that probably are least able to help themselves are going to be hurt the worst. The persons at the universities, those that are already getting the resources and the support that they need to be emotionally strong, are probably going to be able to live through it okay. But the majority of the disabled that really need the help, those that don't find their ways to the universities, and those that perhaps aren't able to become as independent as they might, are going to really be hurt by it. And you find that we have an awfully lot of disabled persons in the United States today. They call it a silent majority, and it certainly is. So I think Graham Rudman on those particular disabled persons is going to have a devastating effect.
Can you give us numbers? How many disabled do we have?
It's difficult to define. It's hard to define disability. A disability for myself might be different for somebody that's equally disabled because of the way you feel about it. I may not feel as disabled as somebody else that is a quadriplegic like myself. The census has never really dealt with that issue. There have been estimates. It's estimated that there are anywhere from 60 to 90 million disabled people in the United States today. Now that's a significant number of people. That's probably the greatest minority that we have in the nation. Now when you look at the kinds of money that we spend on the disabled, it's estimated that by 1990, for rehabilitation and for maintenance, we'll be spending close to $1 trillion supporting disabled persons. Now, in my opinion, that's a catastrophic kind of an event. It's a kind of an event that the nation is not going to be able to continue to do. So I think that we're going to have to find some ways to do that, and I think Ball State's program is a perfect example of that. Helps the disabled really become independent, learn how to manage their disability so they can go into the community and be a tax-paying citizen and be supportive.
Ball State is very proud of its programs for the disabled and was a leader in this area. Is that pride justified in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. You'd have to admit I'm a little biased on that fact, but I've traveled around the country. I've run my own handicap services program at Marquette University. I've always looked up to Ball State's program. I think it's one of the best in the nation. And I think one of the reasons for that is the great respect that Ball State and the faculty and staff have for all students. They're tremendous in providing resources and having a supportive environment to be sure that students can really build and grow and learn to manage that disability. So I have a lot of respect for Ball State's handicap service program.
That's academically. Now, physically, they have a good program that allows accessibility.
That's correct. That program isn't that old either. That program was developed in the early 1970s, and if you take a look at how quickly that program's grown in 10 to 15 years, it's amazing to see what the university has done. I think another thing that's worth noting about that program in terms of the physical accessibility is how aesthetically nice it looks. It doesn't look like a medical environment. It looks pleasing. It's nice to look at. And I think that, a lot of merit is deserved by the people who did the planning for that program.
You have been very successful in your work. You received 3 degrees from Ball State.
That's correct.
And you worked for a while at Ball Corporation.
Right.
And in the early years. How many, in your graduating class, for example, your final degree, how many disabled got jobs? Well, we can put it in the broader sense. What percentage of the disabled who go to a university like Ball State actually enter the workforce?
I think sometimes you'd be surprised at how few do. I think eventually a lot do. But that points to a problem, I think, that could almost be defined as discrimination in terms of employment in the disabled. I think it's a fact. If you have 2 equally qualified people, one happens to be disabled, the other one happens not to be disabled, an employer interviews those 2 equally qualified people, the bet could most easily be with the non-disabled person getting that job. I've experienced that in trying to find employment myself. It's very, very difficult, and employers are a little hesitant to give a job to a disabled person. Now, I think that puts a tremendous amount of responsibility on the disabled person's shoulder to try to make sure that in the interview they have a positive image, they sell themselves. They have to try just a little bit harder. And I think that's another thing that Ball State has done. They've tried to prepare that student so that they do feel comfortable with themselves and they do sell themselves to a prospective employer.
Do you see eventually, within a generation, within 10 years, 5 years, an acceptance, just an acceptance of the disabled without all these barriers, regardless of how high, a mini barrier or a major barrier?
I guess, to be honest with you, I really don't see our society accepting the disabled. I think that what's going to happen is that over the years, society is going to adjust to having disabled persons in society, just like society adjusts to having any other minority person. Be it color of skin, whatever it might be. I think people are interested in citizens that appear differently. And I think society is interested in the disabled because they appear differently. We function maybe a little bit differently in our jobs. We have to live a little differently in society. We require things other than sidewalks and curbs. We have to have curb cuts and ramps and things like that. For that reason, there's always going to be a struggle to be sure that society understands the needs of the disabled. And so I'm not really sure that society will ever accept the disabled, just as they may not accept other minorities. But I think they'll adjust to it, and I think our nation as being a melting pot is maybe most symbolic for the disabled society. Perhaps we'll be able to absorb into society just like everybody else. And I hope that that's a dream that over the years we can see come true. And I certainly think that Ball State is moving in that direction to help people do that.
Dr. Raymond Tucker, professor of psychology at Bowling Green University, inspired his Ball State University audience, as he did us, when he talked with us about being positive in a negative world. Dr. Tucker, you're talking about being positive in a negative world.
Mm-hmm.
With some of the things that are going on, it's sometimes a little difficult to be positive.
It's very difficult to be positive in the world in which we live for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a negative world. That's the first thing we have to determine. And if you don't think so, all you have to do is ask anybody, how are you? And stand by, as they say in the Navy, for a ram. They are likely to lay on all the negatives about their life, what's not happening, what the administration is doing to them, what the rest of the world is doing to them. They really believe this is true, and it probably is. Being positive, however, in the world in which we live says, despite what is happening in the world, all of this is going on, I can't afford to wallow in negativism, because if I do, basically I'm going to end my life wishing that I had been more positive, because negativism does nothing more than make you unhappy. It takes the fun out of life. Even though things are tough, you can approach them in positive ways. Really, that's the only option there is. Anything else is going to lead you, as I say, to unhappiness and really looking at your life and saying, I'm not having much fun with life. That's the biggest reason why you have to change your attitude.
Well, how do we deal with things like major tragedies or a series of tragedies?
Well, for example, you may be referring to what's going on in the country today with the terrorism. You can't be very positive about that. It's there. But you can be very positive about the way you react to it and the way it affects your relationships with other people. In other words, things can happen in the country, depression, unemployment, terrorism, and so forth and so on, and millions of people begin to wallow in this negativism, and it wears them down, turns them into the kind of a person that they don't want to be. Whereas if they said, look, yes, there are terrible things going on in the world, and I don't like them. And nobody would like to have them in their life if they didn't have to, but they're there. So the only thing I can do now, therefore, is to not let it affect my personal life. In other words, my relationship with you should not be dictated on the fact that we have all these problems in the world. I can't let that change my attitude toward you or toward my colleagues, family, or the rest of the world. But millions of people do. In other words, if there's a serious problem in their environment, they let it affect them personally, and their positivism goes way down.
Do we separate those things over which we have control and those we don't have control over?
No, I don't think so. We don't separate them out very much. That's the problem, I really think. We don't separate them. In other words, if I can't control terrorism very much, and I can't, I really should look at that and say, this is one of the things in your life over which you have no control. So stop worrying about it in terms of, can I do anything about it? The answer is, I can do very, very little. And let me focus my life on the areas where I can do something about it. In other words, in my human relations, the way I treat the people on the job, the way I treat my family, the way I treat Mr. and Mrs. North and South America.
That's very true, because just driving to work, thinking about terrorism, I became antagonized and built up this resentment, and that would affect my attitude towards fellow employees, my attitude towards the job.
Yes, absolutely. That's been well demonstrated. Things that are going on in the world, they have an adverse effect on us, and we let them take over a portion of our life and personality for the day, the month, or the year. The trick is, of course, not to let that happen. I think it is very easy, as a matter of fact, to be positive no matter what is happening to you. One of the things we've oversold in this country, for example, is everything should be neat and should be right, and that famous rose garden should always be there for us to walk through, and it isn't. And we've sort of given the notion that if it isn't, then you should be terribly upset about this whole thing, rather than the idea that life is a good, healthy fight. We're up against tremendous odds sometimes. There is evil in the world. There is suffering in the world. There is terrorism in the world, and we have to accept that and say, despite the fact that these things exist, that is not going to influence me. Life is not simply to be lived only when things are going very, very well for us. We have to be positive, even when negativism is coming at us in droves in freight cars.
Now, that's easy to say. That's
You're right.
good. We can read this in books.
That's right.
We can talk about it in lectures such as you're doing today. All right. How do you deal with it on a personal basis? I mean, not generally, but specifically. Just take, for instance, we all have these moments of depression and downness. You're talking about a whole attitude.
Okay,
now.
I'll give you a very good example. It is well known that everybody doesn't love us, right? Everybody doesn't like us. Come right down to it, why should they? Opinions differ all the time on us and everything else. There's no reason why everybody should like us. Let's say that I go into a fast food restaurant and they give me bad food, and I send it back. Okay? I exercise my assertive rights. Well, the waiter doesn't like it. And I get these nonverbals, these bad nonverbals, rejecting nonverbals, that something wrong with my head for sending this back, and who needs you in my life, and that kind of thing. Now, I say this about that. I don't need that person's approval for me to feel good about myself. I realize that people can be very negative toward me, but still I have a decision to make as whether or not I'm going to let that affect me. And when I get negativism in my life, and I may tell you that I get very little because I don't expect it, and that's a big factor. When I get it, I handle it. And I don't say, well, gee, because this thing is happening over here, this person said or did this thing to me, therefore I must and I'm obligated to behave in this negative way. I'm not obligated at all. I can control how I am going to react to anybody under any circumstances, whether or not it's the death of somebody in my family, or whatever the case may be. I can say, are you going to let that get you down? Are you going to let that turn you into the kind of person that you don't want to be? Or are you going to maintain your positiveness in life? Well, I know this. The reason we're having this seminar is I know that when I end my life, and I have gone out of my way to be positive, that I'm going to be able to say, unlike millions of Americans, that my life was a happy life, that I had fun in life, and I was glad that I was alive. So many millions that I meet, and I don't meet millions, I meet thousands, feel just the opposite. Their life at the moment, regardless of what age it is, isn't all that satisfying. I don't want that in my life, and I don't think anybody has to have it in their life, and it is essentially due to the way they are thinking about what's happening to their life. You can think any way you want. It is your choice and my choice to think positively or negatively about anything that is happening to us. I choose positiveness, and I feel great, and the people that I influence in life feel the same way.
Does this project to people that are close to you? Does your attitude, and would that happen with other people who adopt this point of view, a positive outlook on life? Is it a contagious sort of thing?
Always has been contagious and always will. Positive people tend to get positive reactions from other people because they're positive. And as I mentioned this morning, even negative people don't like negative people. They like positive people. All you have to do is look at anybody in your environment. You come to work in the morning and they say, "Hi there, good morning." How do you feel? If they said, "Hello," right away they've made a little bit of a dent on you if you allow it to happen. But surely if they say, "Good morning, great to see you," that's contagious. Yes, positive attitude, in my opinion, cures everything. Positive action cures everything. It is the most contagious thing in the world. We love being around positive people. Not Pollyannas, not super saccharine people who feel that everything is totally beautiful and there is no evil in the world at all. That's totally unrealistic. But we love being around realistic, positive people because in our hearts we know they're right, just as Barry Goldwater said several years ago. In your heart, you know they're right. Even negative people believe in their hearts that you're right being positive. You can't come up with one good reason in this world for negativism, not one. And you can come up with thousands for positivism.
And to sum it up, really, when you look at it, the glass is half full rather than half empty.
That's the greatest example in the world right there. Is it half full or half empty? That's exactly right. And so much of life, and we've known this, from studies in elementary perception theory and psychology. Everything depends on how you want to look at it. What do you want to focus on? Do you want to focus on how much is there or how much is not there? That's it. Exactly right. Greatest summary statement in the world.
Barbara Ann Shelby heads the New Horizon Planning Group in Paducah, Kentucky. Speaking at Ball State University's Economic Development Academy seminar, she has some interesting comments on how a community can utilize its human resources to accomplish economic goals. Ms. Shelby, how can we utilize our community resources to greatest advantage?
I really think community development and industrial development of our communities is everybody's responsibility. And in my 20 years in the development business, I have tried to be very creative in using all of the resources within a community. Anybody who's willing to work, anyone who's willing to listen. The jobs that the people do in development are very lonely jobs, and they're also time-consuming, and you can't do it by yourself. And if a community is going to commit to their future, they better be prepared to work for their future together, shoulder to shoulder, and that's just the concept that I tried to bring to the conference here.
How do you motivate people? Everyone says, yes, I will do it, and then maybe out of 40 people who say, yes, I'll do it, you might get 2 or 3.
I think it's the responsibility of the developer to present the program in an enthusiastic way. And I think that that person then becomes the program. And if people believe in you and what you're trying to accomplish for their community and their future, they will get on the bandwagon. They will find some way to participate, either with dollars or time or service.
You have a business development service.
Yes.
Company that how do you approach a community? How do you work with them so that they can develop these resources?
Well, actually, what I did for the conference was just one segment of what I do. We are an image building company. We do total community development, packaging of those communities with marketing materials, and then we teach them how to use them. Now, the only way you're going to get the best use for your marketing materials, your brochures and your videos, is to call in community people. And if that is presented and the community understands that this is a hidden resources that they have, they actually are saving themselves dollars. They're saving themselves marketing dollars by using their own citizens to go out and tell and sell the community when they travel, when they have business clients into the town. You have to instill that sense of responsibility. They have to understand that they don't forget about the place that they live when they leave the city limits. In one community that I worked in, we developed a small brochure, and the businessmen were taking them to the National Hardware Men's Association meeting in San Francisco or Seattle. Every community, every day, has people leaving for other places. And ironically, they always forget about home. Home is just someplace to come back to. But because of the strategic planning that needs to be done, because of the economics of our country now, they better be thinking about ways to develop that community all the time. And you teach them to do that.
But not only businessmen, anyone in the community.
Anyone. Teacher goes away to a convention, why shouldn't she take 10 small brochures and talk about her town? You never know who you're going to sit next to on a plane. I had an occasion one time where I picked up a magazine that a gentleman had left on the plane. It was a magazine that was addressed to him at his business address, which happened to be a large manufacturing firm in Illinois. I contacted him, and he complimented me on his creativity. But 3 weeks later, he came to our community to look at an industrial site. It's just one of those things. You have to be after it all the time. And I'm not a lazy person. I enjoy looking for new ways. I had a fisherman one time that used to check the seals on the cars, the parking stickers on the cars, as a way to develop prospects for a community. Now, you're not going to get every one of them, because the closing ratio in our business is like 1 in 10,000 contacts. It's not like insurance that I believe now the national statistics are 1 in 5 or 2 in 5. But you do get to meet people, and you do get the word out. Whether they locate or not, they're now aware of you. And they may tell somebody else.
That 1 in 10,000 is very important to the community usually.
Yes, yes.
A lot of competition for
Yes.
it, too. What seems to be the most important economic development goals for a community? Are there standards or typical?
No, I can't say that. I would have said 10 years ago, yes, everybody wanted a manufacturing industry in their town. But because the trends now are more towards the service industries, we can look at smaller numbers. We don't have to go after a plant that employs 1,200 people or 2,000 people. We can look at maybe 5 plants that employ 200 each. We get the same benefit for the community, and we disperse the monies coming into our community from different sources of tax base, and therefore it provides a more stable base for the community.
Yeah, you have two, and if one leaves, you're
Right,
not completely...
right. You're just not devastated. And you see, you look at, no matter what you pick up, today and this morning I picked up the newspaper, some large manufacturing firm of farm equipment in this town had actually devastated the entire economy. You know, people were 3 and 5 years without, without jobs. And one of the problems with that is, looking at it from a developer's point of view, when a manufacturer leaves a huge amount of square footage behind in a community, who do you market it to? By the time you upgrade that building, get it prepared to go back on the marketplace, because it's usually a 20 or 30-year-old facility, who do you get to come and look at that facility? Whereas a nice 30,000, 50,000 square foot building can be snapped up in the marketplace today like that.
Then they all want to know, why did the other business leave, and so
Right.
forth. That's
Right.
a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, then you would say that the community resources, the human resources, are very important and the key to successful community development.
Exactly, and I think it's going to be more so in the future, because people are more aware now than they were 20 years of what their responsibilities were. You can't live in a community, breathe the air, send your children to the school, participate in all the social things that you have, and not worry about the future. We lived in a very today society. We better start thinking about the future.